Oklahoma.
I've listened very carefully to the two previous speakers on the floor, and I understand a lot of their frustration. We are where we are. I think we have two big problems. Actually, we have two major problems. One is our country is bankrupt. People don't like to hear that, but let me give you what the facts are. The total unfunded liabilities of the United States of America is $126 trillion. If you add all the net worth of everybody in the country and all the assets of the federal government and all the assets of the state, and you combine them, we have $94 trillion worth of assets. We're already in the hole, $30 trillion. That doesn't include the $17 trillion in debt that we have. So I'd like to correct a couple of things. One, the senator from Michigan mentioned that we were downgraded because of the impasse in Congress. No, we got downgraded because Congress has failed to address the real problems of our debt and deficits. Go read their statement. Had nothing to do with action here. It had to do with the fact that we will not address the biggest problems in front of us. And I just for a minute like for us to consider it. I ask unanimous consent to have some scissors on the floor because I want to make a point in a minute.
Is there objection? Without objection.
We have a credit card. And I want you to think about your own personal life. That if in fact you have a limit on your credit card and your financial situation worsens, you're still paying the payments, but you're not bringing down the principal on your credit cards, and you're not earning any more money significantly, and you go ask Citibank or American Express or Chase and you say, I want you to raise my limit. You know the first thing you're going to ask you? Is what have you done to improve your financial situation so that we might consider raising your credit limit? That's what happens to every other American. And we have this big talk about a debt limit. There's no debt limit in this country. We've increased it every time it's come up. There is no limit right now in this country on the debt that we have. So we hear all these speeches about the risk. You know what the real risk is? The risk is continuing to do nothing to address the underlying problems of our country. The risk is continue to add entitlement programs that have no way to pay for themselves and no reform of the entitlements that we have today. That's the risk. And how does that play out? We've heard all these dire warnings of what's going to happen. Well, here's what's going to happen to your children and grandchildren. What has happened over the last 15 years in this country. Do you realize the average median family income in real dollars now is at the same level it was in 1989? We're going backwards right now. Not addressing the real problems. And let me put it in medical terms since I'm a doctor. If in fact you treat symptoms of disease, raising the debt limit, rather than treating the real disease, which is reforming the problems, reforming our spending, quit having 100% involvement in everything Americans do from the federal government. If you continue to borrow the money and treat that as the symptom, when spending, the lack of oversight by Congress, the lack of real work by the members of this body to actually eliminate waste, which is over $250 billion a year, as outlined by the Government Accountability Office. And yet we ignore that for the political arena that we've seen the last couple of weeks in Washington. The real disease is not fixing the real problem. And of all the politicians, Republicans and Democrats alike, we want to give you a soft answer. Well, here's the answer. If you're $30 trillion in debt that you can't pay for, what you have to do is have everybody have some pain. we refuse to do that. There's no leadership in Congress to address the real disease that we're facing. A government that's totally ignored the enumerated powers. A government that totally ignores the 10th Amendment. And now a Justice Department that really ignores the rule of law in terms of how they decide what they'll enforce and what they won't, always on a political basis rather than on what the law says. Those are the real problems in front of us. And so when we hear all the dire warnings about, oh, you can't not raise the debt limit, well, what does default mean? Because they always say you can't raise the debt limit, but they won't talk about what default means. Default in the international financial community is you won't pay the interest and you won't pay back the principal on your bonds. That is never going to happen to us. It will require less than 6% of the cash we're taking in now to manage the debt we have right now. Less than 6%. So only somebody who wants to hurt us further would play the political game if we ever got there, and I'm not saying we should get there, but if we got there, would only play the political game to not pay Social Security or not pay Medicare or not take care. We have more than enough money to do that. But what we have is a bloated, oversized, inefficient, ineffective federal government that nobody wants to hold accountable except the American people. So the question is who gets to decide? Congress obviously isn't deciding very well. The president hadn't shown any leadership on it. Maybe it's time for the American people to decide. Maybe it's time to take some of the power away from Washington and restore it where our founders thought it should reside, by respecting the enumerated powers, very specifically listed by our founders with very great commentary so that it wouldn't be distorted, but we've distorted it anyway, and re-embracing the 10th Amendment, which says everything that's not specifically enumerated in these powers is left to the power of the people and the states. So we find ourselves with a credit card. This happens to be our debt. The number I chose to put on here was our debt this morning. $16,747,458,528.90. We need to cut this up. Just like you do for an adolescent or young adult kid that you're responsible for the credit card. If they're not responsible, you cut up the credit card. You fix the real problem. You don't continue asking for an increase in their profligate spending. You don't continue to reward members of Congress who won't do oversight and get rid of $250 billion worth of fraud, waste, and abuse every year. But that's what we'll end up doing, because we don't have the courage nor the leadership to address what is the real problem in front of our country. And the real problem is cowardice. The real problem is to not recognize where we are and not act on making decisive decisions. Now, we heard how bad it'll be if we don't raise the debt limit. I agree, it's going to be tough. There'll be ramifications. How bad will it be if we do? What happens to your children? What happens to the declining family income in this country if we do? If we continue to let the federal government run uncontrolled and out of control? If we continue to not hold Congress accountable for forcing efficiencies on the federal government? You know, it can be done. There was an agreement called the Budget Control Act. And what it did is it forced sequester. Sequester is a stupid way to cut funding in the federal government, but it's far better than not cutting it at all. And what has sequester done? Sequester has forced agencies, because Congress won't force them, because we're afraid we might offend somebody. It has forced agencies to start making choices. Now, they're still making tons of bad choices, like the State Department on the last day of their budget spent all the remaining money. They just spent $500,000. No, it was $5 million, pardon me. It was $5 million on new crystalware for all of our embassies. Do we have $5 million? What's wrong with the crystalware we have now? But they had to spend the money because we couldn't come back to Congress and say we saved $5 million. So we're addressing the wrong problems. We're not holding people accountable. And so consequently, maybe it's time for the states to exert and the people to exert some common sense on us. I dare say there's not one member of this body that would let their adolescent child run up a bill and then not eventually try to intercede on a credit card, but just let them continue to run it up. Well, Congress and the U.S. government is that adolescent child. We are the adolescents, and the people and the states are the grown-ups. And we're at where we are today, at an impasse, and it really does kind of sound like kindergarten. I'm not going to talk to you. I don't like the way you did that. You know, we had the majority leader the other day claim that the House was out of bounds because they got to pick and choose what we'd pay for. You know, it just so happens in the Constitution, that's what it says. The House of Representatives gets to pick and choose. All spending bills start in the House. They have to start in the House. They get to pick and choose. Now, we don't have to accept it, but they get to pick and choose. So just a lack of understanding on the basic concepts that our founders set up. You know, they know the history, and they knew the history of republics. Republics always die. There isn't one that has survived as long as we have. And they decline and die over the same thing. They get in trouble financially. We're in trouble financially. We're $30 trillion in the hole, plus another $17 trillion in debt. Wouldn't it be smart if we started addressing that problem before we blankly give an increase in the level of the credit card? Actually, what we should do is we should cut this credit card up, which is what I'm going to do, because that's the way I vote. I think it's time we quit borrowing money. Actually, I think I'll just tear it up. It's time we quit borrowing money against the future of our kids. It's time we quit mortgaging their future. It's time we start taking responsibility for the actions of the federal government rather than giving excuses on why we can't get together and address the real problems of this country. Congress fails to do the oversight. You know, we just had a hearing yesterday where we showed one of the problems inside the Social Security disability system. It was a bipartisan hearing, lots of work done. There are real problems. That trust fund, for those people who are truly disabled in this country, will run out of money within 18 to 24 months. Finance Committee hadn't offered any bill to fix it. House and Ways hadn't offered any, Ways and Means hadn't offered any programs to fix it. But yet it's going to be bankrupt. What does that mean for somebody who's truly disabled? It means their check's going to get cut. Now tell me whether you'd rather spend $5 million on new glassware for our embassies, crystal, or $5 million for somebody who's truly disabled. That's where the real decisions need to be made, but we won't make them. You know, if you talk about our national debt, when I came to the Senate in 2005, every American owed $24,000 on the national debt. It's now almost $53,000 in a little over 8.5 years. So 2.5 times what we used to owe, we now owe. How did we get there? Why did we do that? Why did we let that happen? Why don't we learn to live within our means? Is there always a political reason? Is there always a reason where you can game somebody to say they don't care if you don't want to do this? You certainly couldn't care about Americans if you don't want to spend money that we don't have on things that we don't need. If you look at the $120-some trillion, $125.8 trillion, that works out to $1.1 million per family. Now think about that. That's our unfunded liabilities, and that's going to come due over the next 50 years, And if you have children or grandchildren like I do, I really don't want their opportunities to be totally limited by this debt load that we're having. So we have all this politicking and posturing and political expediency going on in both bodies, and nobody's talking about what the real problem is. The real problem is we're spending a lot of money that we don't have, that we're borrowing from other countries on things we don't absolutely need. The second part of the problem is we have programs that are designed to benefit people that are riddled with waste and fraud. $100 billion in Medicaid and Medicare. Nobody really questions that number. It's been authenticated by 4 separate studies outside of the government. The inside of the government, we say it's 80. Why would we continue to let a system run that has that kind of fraud in it? We're getting ready to crank up the Affordable Care Act. We are cranking it up. And we've now said we're not going to authenticate somebody's reliability as to their income. What do you think the fraud on that's going to be? We know in the child tax credit what the fraud rate is. It's well over 20%. In the earned income tax credit, we know it's well over 20%. So 1 out of every $5 we pay out there is to people who don't deserve it. We're going to see the same thing in this. Why would we do that when we have this kind of problem in front of us? You know, in the last 2 years, our debt limit has increased twice what our economy has grown. And for every dollar of new debt we take in, we're getting about 2 to 3%, 2 or 3 cents of economic growth out of it, out of that new debt. Used to be, America, when they'd borrow a dollar, it'd get 35 or 40 cents of growth out of that debt. So we now have, in the last 2 years, we've increased the debt limit to $0.405 trillion, and the economy's grown less than $1.2 trillion in the last 2 years. We are adding $26,000 to our national debt every second. Every second. And there's no question, our economy's growing, some. Far less than marginal. And why isn't it growing? It isn't growing because the American people don't have confidence in the future. How do we restore confidence in the future? We restore confidence by modeling a behavior that says we're going to act responsibly with their future, which means we're going to make the hard choices, even if it costs us our political career, to solve the problems in Washington so that the generations that follow us will not suffer a lower standard of living, but also so we can instill the confidence in the American economy. You know, it's $3 trillion in cash sitting in this country right now. Not federal government money, private money. $3 trillion. Why is it sitting there and why isn't it being invested? It's not being invested. That $3 trillion would create 700,000 or 800,000 new jobs a year. That $3 trillion. Why is it not being? Because they don't have the confidence in the future. I want to tell you a story about Virgil Juergensmeyer. Virgil grows mushrooms in a business and other vegetables. And this past August, he told me that he was thinking about expanding his business, about a $5 million expansion to add a couple hundred jobs in a very small town in northeastern Oklahoma. And yet he was afraid to do that. He has plenty of business. He's buying $50,000 to $100,000 worth of product from his competitor every month because he can't produce it. He says, I don't think it's worth the risk right now given where our country is. I'm not sure. Well, that's happening all across this country. There's no confidence. So it brings me to the second point that I wanted to talk about. We're not just bankrupt as a nation. Our leadership is bankrupt. Leadership is about creating a vision and bringing people together, not creating controversy and dividing people. It's not about pointing out the worst flaws of somebody. It's about reinforcing the best flaws. It's about selling the confidence that we can do this together. And do you realize we can do this together as a nation? There isn't a problem in front of us that we can't solve if we choose to solve it. You remember the Debt Commission? I was a member of that committee. We voted on some big plans that would have solved a lot of the problems that we're facing this very week in this body. I didn't like every bit of it, but it was a chance to try to bring together both sides and solve it. Not once was it taken up on the floor by the majority leader. The president never embraced it. His own commission, his own fiscal commission, never embraced it. It was the greatest failure of leadership I've ever seen because you had bipartisan cover. You had conservatives and liberals agreeing that here is a plan that we can work out. And yet it was thrown away. And the only time with the politics that we see in Washington today that you're going to solve these big problems is when both political parties take the pain evenly. And nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to gain. It's all short-term political expediency. In the words of my friend Erskine Bowles, where we are today is the most easily predictable problem you would have ever seen. All you got to do is look at the path of the numbers. It's true our deficits are down a little bit, but we raised $70 billion in taxes last year, and the economy's growing. It just shows what potential there is if we would put the economy on a steam where we had confidence. You know, we could add $500–600 billion a year in revenues to the federal government. But we won't do that. Today we find ourselves in worse condition than we did in 2011. And in 2011 we were told we can't do big things. You have to wait. So we had a debt limit increase. So tell me how we've gotten better since then. We have unfunded liabilities are growing faster every year. Our true debt to GDP ratio is now over 100%, counting all debt, internal and external. We've not done it. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers right now are furloughed because Congress, not Republicans, Congress, has failed to do its job, has failed to compromise, has failed to reach a meaningful agreement that gives both groups something that they can claim that they actually worked on the real disease. Madam President, how much time have I consumed?
23 minutes.
All right, I'll finish. Would you let me know at about 28 minutes, please?
Without objection.
Let me describe also what's going to happen in about 20 years, maybe 10. If we don't address these problems, it won't matter what the debt rating agencies say. We will have developed a pattern that says we think we can continue to borrow and continue to raise the limit and not make the structural changes that puts us on a path to solvency. So what does that look like? What that looks like is borrowing costs going up. My friends all talk and the President said today maybe our borrowing costs will go up if in fact we don't raise the debt limit. Well, guess what? Our borrowing costs are going up every day that we don't address these problems, whether we raise the debt limit or not. Because eventually the rest of the world's going to say we don't think they're willing to cut up the credit card. They're not willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary to put our country on a path to prosperity. We have all the capabilities in the world to address our problems. We do not have the leadership that will get us there. And I'm not just directing that at the President. I'm directing that at my own party. So what's the solution? I'm going to spend the next couple of days outlining waste in the federal government, fraud in the federal government, duplication in the federal government. But the solution is called sacrificial leadership. It means modeling the behavior that says you're willing to give up something, maybe the prestige of being in office, to actually fix the long-term problems of our country. It's leadership that calls out the best of us instead of pointing out the worst in us. You don't see that very often here. You did when I first came. You certainly don't now, and that's a function of leadership in the Senate. Majority Leader Reid and I don't agree on much, that's obvious, but in a previous discussion on the Senate floor, Leader Reid said meaningful deficit reduction requires shared sacrifice. We're never going to get there unless everybody shares in it. The other point I would make is we're living off the next generation right now. We're going to borrow $2,000 against the future of every man, woman, and child in this country this year alone. They're going to have to pay it back. Or another way of putting it is 1 out of every 4 hours that you work, the federal government right now is confiscating of everybody in our economy. And it's soon going to be 2 out of every 4 hours you work. Now, our country was founded on the idea of liberty and freedom. When the confiscatory rates that will have to be there to pay back our debt or to at least borrow more money come, half of your work is going to be for the federal government, not your state or local. It's going to be to pay the bills of the federal government. And so money that's going to go to interest is money that isn't going to be invested. It's money that isn't going to improve education, isn't going to invent the next new technology. So I believe we can solve our problems, but I think it requires an informed public. Do you realize the federal government is twice the size it was in 1999? Right? It's twice. It's 2 times as big as it was in 1999. Think about that for a minute. If you extrapolate, that means in another 12 years, 13 years, it's going to be 4 times as big as it was in 1999. And the question comes is, are you getting value? Is it efficient? Is it productive? Is it what we want to do? I think we can cheat history as a republic. As a constitutional republic, I think we can cheat history. I don't think we have to go down the path that every other republic has gone down. But it's going to require real leadership and shared sacrifice on everybody in this country part. It's going to require we take the spending out of the tax code for the well-heeled that have placed special benefits in the tax code for themselves. It's going to require that we reform Medicare.
Senator has consumed 28 minutes.
Thank you. That we reform Medicare. That we fix Medicaid. That we control how the federal government buys and uses things. It's going to require us to eliminate multitudes of duplicative programs that have no real benefit other than to benefit the politicians. It's going to require shared sacrifice. So we can go down that path, unite our country, bring us together with a vision that through this together, we can all accomplish what is needed for our children and grandchildren. Or we can continue this petty little kindergarten game that's going on in Washington right now that everybody knows get bent out of shape, saying they're right or they're right, and playing off the merit. None of us in Washington are right. The founders were right. The enumerated powers were right. The 10th Amendment was right. We're dead wrong. It's time we grow up and start understanding the vision of our founders that secures our liberty and preserves our future. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President.